One, two, one, two, three, four.
Welcome, everyone. This is Joe Dagger, the host of the Business 901 podcast. With me today is Keatron Evans. He is the managing partner at KM CyberSecurity, a global information security consulting business which includes penetration testing, incident response management and consulting, digital forensics, and training. Keatron is also a senior security advisor at Savvius and a top-rated instructor for ISACA and ISACA. He is also one of the authors of Chained Exploits, Advancing Hacking Attacks from Start to Finish, a textbook still used by the U.S. government security agencies. Keatron, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Joe.
You've been in cybersecurity for a long time, and I'm inquisitive. How'd you get started in it? And was it even called cybersecurity back then?
Yeah, so it was not called cybersecurity back then. Nobody really called it anything. It was just one of those weird IT things that was kind of buried amongst all the other things that IT and computer people did. So there wasn't really a cybersecurity, and there wasn't even really the word security associated with computers when I got started in it. But the way I got started is I was just very curious really early on. So I was actually doing hacking activities and doing things like exploiting systems before I even figured out that that's what I was doing. And it all started as I was growing up in Mississippi. You know, I grew up in a very large family. And my dad, didn't make a lot of money, so we couldn't afford things. So what happened is I was able to, to give myself internet access by taking the little net zero free 30-day CDs that they used to send out. And I would get those things and give myself free 30 days on like a library computer or somewhere like that. And I figured out how to very early on get into the net zero servers, get a list of all the accounts of everyone in the world actually that use net zero. So I was able to just hop around and pick an account and use it to give myself access just for, until I was able to afford it or come up with other ways to get it. And of course, back then, there wasn't any laws against it. Like nobody could come after you or anything like that. They would just say, hey, we noticed that you were doing this, stop it. So I was actually very early on hacking as a kid then and just didn't know what it was called.
Well, that's kind of scary that you could even do that back then with very little training, right?
Yeah, natural proclivity to find out how things work, I guess.
What's really changed in all these years? You said, about the laws are one day back then and everything, but I know that it's a totally different web now. But really, have the basics changed? Is there still people that just is inquisitive that like you were and tried to break in to give yourself more access?
Yeah, there's definitely still people like that. But some big changes that have happened is, number one, if you look at the last 20 years, we've evolved as to how much information we put on computers and how much information we send across computers. So the whole concept of cybercrime has evolved with that. The criminals are still doing the things that they did before we even had computers. It's just that now the information and the data they're after is in computers, so computers become now victims and tools of the crime. What happened is when I started in the industry, being a security person, it was rarely even heard of. So now it's turned into this big industry because as more data ended up connected and as more data ended up on the internet, there were more breaches. People needed to protect that data more. There turned out to be a huge need for people with technical security skills. And as a result of that, the industry kind of started to take off. So I was lucky enough to be one of the people that was in the industry very early on, and that allowed me to get a lot of headway and kind of become a little bit of a leader just from being in the right place at the right time. So that was a big part of it.
Well, I think timing is everything, isn't it?
Yeah, it absolutely is. It absolutely is. And the other half of that too is as the demand peak, then all of a sudden there was money involved in cybersecurity. And if you had these skills, you could go and make lots of money. And then that word got around. So now everybody that knew anything about computers are trying to get into cybersecurity now. And, just to give you a point of reference, when I taught my first ethical hacking class all the way back in 2003, the class would be made up of people that had at least 10 years IT experience, right? So it was people that were in IT for a while and they were coming into this to learn the security and this hacking thing. Well, now my average class, there's usually maybe 1 or 2 people out of 20 that have even more than 2 years experience in IT, and most of them have 0 experience in security. So a lot of the fundamentals of networking, the fundamentals of how memory works and all of these things, I have to teach that in those classes now, whereas back then that stuff was just common knowledge. So it just shows you how the industry has evolved into this very high demand thing. So now you have an influx of people coming in, some of them without any technical background, trying to elevate themselves really quickly into it. So that's led to a lot of demand for not just the consulting and the skills, but the training as well.
Okay. Well, we always think though that there's this powerful state, like the Russians hacking the DNC, Democratic National Party. But why does the average business, I guess, need to understand cybersecurity? I mean, so what? I mean, people aren't after my manufacturing data, are they?
Well, they are. Actually, one of the things that's changed as well over the years is if you look at China, for example, and some of the other threats, China actually has a stated mission. The government has a stated and written and documented mission to basically steal as much intellectual property from us and other developed countries as they possibly can. So they actually have a coordinated mission and they have money behind it. They actually have a division of their military whose mission it is to actually steal as much information as they can from U.S. and other companies. And this includes things that we consider to be as benign as manufacturing information and things like that. Because even with manufacturing, there's trade secrets, there's intellectual property that this manufacturing company wouldn't want their competitors to know, as far as, how they do this process or how they get certain types of business. So those things are definitely targets. And more importantly than that, what happens is you as a manufacturing, let's say you're a small manufacturing company, you might end up being a proxy or a pawn for a threat agent to attack a government official or a government organization, for example. And they'll use your network and your computing devices as kind of like pawns so that when the government does their forensics, it looks like you did the attack. So that's one thing that smaller companies or people would say, oh, well, they're not after my data. Maybe not, but you have resources. And those resources are just a channel that they can hop into and use to attack other places and kind of mask their identity via you. So that's definitely another thing you have to be concerned with as well. And if you're a public company, you have regulations where you have to be worried about cybersecurity, because if your data gets stolen and it causes the price of that company's shares to drop, then the shareholders have a libel suit against you, because now you're responsible actually legally for maintaining some level of security. And this goes for hospitals and health insurance places. They have something called HIPAA. That's a regulation that says that basically if you have medical information, you're responsible for securing it. Same for any business that takes credit cards as a form of payment. There's something called PCI. That's a regulatory thing that requires you to maintain a certain level of cybersecurity in order to be able to take credit cards. So it's becoming a very regulated thing. If you think about the recent grilling of Mark Zuckerberg with Congress when they had that committee to grill him, the Equifax breach that happened last year, which is probably one of the biggest in history, there was an entire congressional hearing about that breach, and they were, the CEO and some other people had to answer some really tough questions about why they didn't have these controls in place. So I think everybody has to be worried about it to some extent. Some places more than others, but everybody has kind of a responsibility now to do some things.
You really brought up two different questions for me that I thought about. And one is that being that pond, and that's a lot about what your original book was about, chained exploits, wasn't it? It was like, there's just a chain going on and a method. It's kind of like a mind map, a concept map of how someone actually gets compromised, right?
That's absolutely what it was about, sure. And that's one of the big things. So yeah, that's a good connect there.
In there. The other thing that you bring up is that when you talk about government regulation and everything, the first thing that jumps to my mind is, we have these OSHA inspections for safety and health and these things. Are we that far away from having data inspections that we have to meet and get reported on? Is that something that is like, out there in the future, or is it now and I don't even know it?
I mean, yeah, well, it's closer to that it's now and you don't know it. That was recently something that's more of an international thing called GDRP. Now, it was mostly spearheaded by Europeans, but a lot, it's affecting us here in the U.S. as well. But what the things that I named, HIPAA, GLB for banks, SOX for public traded companies, they do have requirements to have a security audit or a penetration test, which is one of the services we provide. They're required legally to have one of those done, depending on the regulation, once a year, once a quarter, every time you make a significant change to the network or to the data structure, you have to have things retested. So there are regulations already in place that require organizations to have at least a yearly penetration test and security audit done.
When I'm sitting there looking at my IT structure and let's say I'm not a developer, I'm a step removed. Is there symptoms I should be looking out for that should be somewhat obvious that I'm being compromised?
Well, you know what? It used to be a lot easier to do that because systems used to be a lot more simple. We did simple things and we only did a few things with our computers. Now we do everything with them. Browsers are smarter, the applications that you use are smarter, and what that leads to is there's more bells and whistles, there's more moving parts, so now it's harder to see that weird thing happening because there's always weird things happening with the increased functionality of what we do with computers. So what's happening now is the attackers are evolving as well, because one big part of hacking and penetration testing is something called evasion and covering your tracks. And it's an entire art form around not setting off bells and whistles and not making it to where people can know that you're doing what you're doing. And in the classes that I teach, we spend an entire half a day just on teaching the students how to do that part. Okay, now you know how to break in. Let's look at how to break in without ever being noticed. So we're doing it in classes for good guys. You can imagine the bad guys are really on the ball with that part of the attack vectors as well.
Yeah. Should it be an external person to my company? I mean, this is really protected information. I mean, this is kind of scary to me to share that. Or should someone be trained internally, or should you just sort of have a mixture with a quarterly review of some type or something?
So, yeah, you kind of need to have both. So basically, having an internal person is ideal. But the problem is most organizations that aren't over a certain size or generate enough revenue, they really can't justify the cost of having an internal person whose full-time job it is to do that. I mean, once these people go out and get these certifications and they actually have the technical chops to do these security audits and to do these penetration tests, they're pretty high salaries. So if you're a regular mom and pop shop with 10 employees, you likely can't even afford to have a person full-time doing that. So what happens is you're kind of forced by virtue to actually have to have someone external to come in and do it once a year and pay them for that one-time engagement versus trying to pay a salary. Now, on the other side of that, we talked about regulations. If you're a bigger organization and you're regulated, then not only are you required to have it done once a year, but you're required to have it done by an external third party. It's almost like even if you have internal pen testers, you still are required to have an external one done. It's almost like you don't let a CPA audit their own books. You have an external public CPA firm do it to maintain integrity and things like that. Because if you're the organization and I hire you and your job is to secure this organization, it's not likely that you're going to rate yourself and say, you know what, I suck at this and I didn't do a good job of secure in the organization when audit time comes around, which is why they kind of regulate that you have a third party do it. And not only that, they regulate that every few years you rotate to a new third party. You don't use the same third party over and over again, because suddenly if you do that too much, that third party becomes part of the organization, an extension, kind of like the Arthur Andersen Enron thing that happened all the way back in 2001, where basically Arthur Andersen was no longer being non-biased. They were kind of part of Arthur Andersen. The relationships had developed so much. So yeah, you have to have it done externally if you're big enough to be under any type of regulation. And it's a good idea to have it externally done if you're small, just because trying to pay the salary of someone doing it internally is really not feasible. And if you take a small company of like 50 people, they might only have one or two IT guys anyway. So trying to give them the additional hat of now auditing and checking security, that's not feasible, because you have someone that's already stretched in, and now you're adding a whole nother big responsibility on. So you're going to end up with not a good job.
Well, it makes sense too, because of the fact it's hard to see your own mistakes a lot of times, right?
Yes. Yep, absolutely.
Are there key things? I mean, should my developer be behind it as a subcontractor for him? How much should, a CEO or a CTO or someone be part of all that? Maybe what are a few of the questions, okay, that I should use to hire intelligently?
Yeah, well, the main thing is, look for a resume. Now we live in a world of Google. We Google people first, and then we talk to them. So we find out. So if it's a organization or a person that's coming to you to offer service, you should be able to find information about them pretty readily on the internet, as far as whether or not they've done good business and that type of thing. And also it helps if you ask for previous pen test reports. For example, if you're looking to have a penetration test done, say, hey, I'd like to see a couple of sanitized penetration test reports that you've done for other organizations. And they should be able to provide that. That shows some of the maturity, because, that's just one of the things that people in the industry ask for. They want to not only know that you're technical and you're good at hacking, but they want to know, are you able to deliver me a report that's going to allow me to make sound investment decisions and sound security decisions based on what that report says? Because some of the best technical people out there have a really hard time relaying that information in a written form that people that aren't technical can understand. And I've been fortunate to have that, I guess you could say, gift, because that's one of the areas that I get a lot of traction and excel in business-wise, is being able to sit in the trenches and do the attacks and demonstrate the attacks, but explain what's going on to someone that may not be technical at the same time, so that when they look at ROI and what they need to invest in, they have a clear picture. We call it enabling the decision makers to make the right security decisions.
Okay. Well, you're holding an upcoming webinar, okay, called Find Out How the Most Secure Places in the World Get Hacked. Tell me a little bit about that webinar. What are you going to cover in it, and what are you going to do?
So we're going to start that webinar off with a live attack. We're going to show you 2 attacks within a matter of like 10 minutes, just to let you see how quickly these hacks happen, how quickly they get onto your server, how quickly they get your data. And then we'll connect the dots kind of to show you how, if we look at the 5 biggest breaches in the last year, one thing they all have in common is none of the attacks were that advanced. They were pretty basic things. There were low-hanging fruit that the attackers were able to get to. And even if you take the biggest one, which, for example, was Equifax, these are vulnerabilities that were discovered passively in security audits that were done much, much earlier than the attack happened, and they just kind of got ignored. And we think a big part of that goes back to what we were just talking about with the reporting properly and things like that, where maybe someone did it and maybe the report got handed over, but it didn't do a good job of relaying the threat, like what the actual threat was to the business decision makers. So there was no action really taken on that. So I'll go through and show the attacks and then show you when we generate, for example, a report, the key things that you should look for in the report as a technical lead and as an executive that may not be technical. Here's what you should be here's what your report should look like, number one, and here's what you should be getting out of that report, depending on what your job role is. So just to kind of give people some free advice on like, look, this is what you should be looking for. And also to kind of paint a roadmap if you have, a lot of people are technical and they want to get into cybersecurity, but they don't know how. So I'm going to kind of paint a roadmap at the end is like, look, this is how you need to step yourself up if you want to really master these skills and bring that expertise into your organization.
What if I just want to be a hacker? Are you going to help me out?
Yeah, I can help you out with that too. We actually have classes to where we train, good guys up on that. Intelligence community, federal law enforcement, just the gatekeepers of Fortune 50 companies, for example. A lot of those security guys that are responsible for securing these organizations, they come to me once a year or so to sit in like a 5-day class to get the updates on, okay, what are the bad guys doing to us now? And I'll teach them those attacks, and then I'll teach them some defensive mechanisms to keep those things from happening to them. And then we just reset next year and start over again because it's a rapidly changing threat landscape.
You put the effort into showing a hack take place in a webinar. Why do you think watching a hack is so important?
For one, I think that when most people think about a hack, they think of it as this complex thing. We kind of say passively, oh, well, the hackers could do this or hackers could do that. Or if you open this email, hackers could get stuff off of your computer. Well, reading that in a paragraph and actually visually seeing it happen has two different shock factors to it, right? So if you see it happen and you see how easy it is, you see someone watching you type something and you see your letters, your words that you're typing showing up on the screen somewhere else, that's quite chilling and quite eye-opening and awakening. So what happens is when you see it happen visibly, it opens up a different muscle in your brain. You interpret the information differently, and it's a different shock factor when you see it versus when you read it in a paragraph somewhere or read an article about how these cyber attacks happen. When someone shows it to you, and the comment I get the most from executives is, I didn't realize how easily it can be done. Like that's probably, if you ask me the number one phrase I've heard from executives and others that have watched my demonstration, the number one phrase is, I had no idea it was that easy. And what they realize very quickly is like, look, it's easy to do this, so we should be checking for this. Why aren't we checking for this? I'm going to go to my IT people and say, are we checking for these things? And that kind of gets the conversation going. And once, what I found is in any organization, if you can get the interest of the executives and the decision makers, and the security decisions are being driven from the top down, you get a lot more action, right? Like if you got IT and IT's the only one paranoid about security and the only one doing something about security, it's not going to have the same weight as a memo from the CEO saying, you better not open that email that says, you're going to get $1 million if you send me $500 because you're exposing the whole organization to cyber attacks. You're going to have a lot more attention being paid to it. So I think everyone should watch these things, even at the executive level, because it empowers the organization. The more educated the decision makers are with cybersecurity, the more empowered the organization is to make more, intelligent cybersecurity decisions.
What really intrigues me of the things you've said here is that it is actually preventable, that you do have clues if you know what to look for. And, just as you said, those ones that were the major hacks, they were in previous reports. They were, let's say, somewhat known. It just wasn't, the information wasn't transferred right. So a lot of this is preventable with just a little bit of background and training. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say. A lot of it is preventable, and the ones that made the news are preventable. But keep in mind, there's an entire underbelly of cyber attacks and breaches that never make it to the news because either they're classified or the organization, it's too embarrassing, so they'd rather just take the hit and not report it if they can get away with not reporting it. So I don't want to make it sound like that, everything can be prevented, because there's really two classes of you getting attacked. One is you happen to just not be doing a good job of paying attention to the basic things that we're talking about, and you just happen to get caught up in a sweep where they're looking for easy targets. Or the other side of that is if an advanced persistent threat targets you, okay? So if you take one of these APT groups, advanced persistent threat groups, that are usually state-sponsored, so they're usually funded by some government organization, and they target you, then there's not a lot you can do to prevent that, okay? But if you look at a lot of the big breaches that have happened, they were still compromised by very basic things. So I don't want to make it sound like if you do these things, it's going to 100% protect you. But if you do these things, it's going to make it harder, much harder for these guys to get at you. But if they target you and they have the funding and the resources, they're going to get in at some point, and there's really not a ton you can do about it. Now, what there is a movement for in the industry is mature security organizations. In other words, companies that have a mature security program have kind of accepted the fact that, look, we're probably going to get breached at some point, right? We're going to get hacked. So how can we continue business? What's our process for business continuity? How do we increase our ability to detect that we've been compromised? So there's a big movement in detection and response where some of the resources are being devoted to that and not so much being spent on preventative. And what that leads to is a much better posture, because if you really understand the attacks, then that puts you in a better position to know when they're happening, because now you know what the attack looks like. All right, so you'll see that it's happening a lot faster than someone that doesn't know it's happening until your data is for sale on the internet somewhere. So learning how to do the attacks and getting on the offensive empowers you to make better detection and response decisions. Now, going forward in the future, there's a lot of companies out there that are boasting things like machine learning and artificial intelligence. It's saying, oh, we're back to prevention now. We can truly prevent because we got artificial intelligence. And I would caution people with that. I actually have a conference coming up in Vegas for ISACA in October of 2018. And in that conference, I'll be talking about the myth, the truth versus the myth is related to how many of your cybersecurity problems artificial intelligence is actually going to solve. Because what amazes me is people seem to forget that if we're doing it, don't you think the bad guys are doing it as well? So you're going to have two AI bots competing against each other. And whenever we have that situation where the good guys and the bad guys are competing, the bad guys have won historically. All right. So it's like we keep not learning lessons. Every time we come out with the latest, greatest whiz-banger, we think that's going to solve all of our cybersecurity problems. And it turns out that later we find out the bad guys have already counted on us doing that, and they've got countermeasures to get around it already. So that's kind of where I see things going now, and that's kind of some of the stuff that we should be looking out for.
Well, I like that idea, the fact that you can, if you are watching, if you are not just all preventing, is that there's a lot being put into is how you can minimize the damage and react to it properly is what you're saying is just as key as prevention.
Absolutely. One other point that I wanted to bring up related to that is I would say in about half of the engagements that I do, about half the penetration tests, when we go in and do a security audit, even though we're not doing forensics, we're not doing incident response in those instances, about half of the times we find what we call indicators of compromise, where the organization's already been breached. The bad guys are already inside, and they just didn't know it. But once we go in there and start working with them and doing the engagement and transferring knowledge, they start to see some of the things that we're showing them, and they're like, oh, yeah, I think that happened, 6 months ago. Let's go take a look. And we start pulling back, layers of that onion, and we find, yeah, you've been compromised for a few years now. And they're constantly exfiltrating data out. So some of the penetration tests have turned into, forensics and incident response gigs where they said, all right, stop the pen test. It's more important that you help us recover from this breach right now. So there's another contract signed, that's different from the pen test that we were bought there for in the first place.
Your book, for a good example, Chained Exploits, is a textbook still used by U.S. government security agency. And you run certification courses. Tell me what it takes to get certified and what you teach there. I mean, I think you've been doing certification courses for a while.
Yeah, I have, and to segue into that, part of the reason I still do the courses is because I get an amazing amount of enjoyment out of sharing the information and putting it out and watching people digest it and coming up with innovative ways to where people actually get it. So that's kind of one of my passions. But yes, I've been doing the certification classes for a really long time. Some of the all of the top training organizations in the industry have used me for various types of classes. And one of the ones that's our main class is Certified Ethical Hacker. So we take someone with basic IT skills, we bring them in, and we teach them the tools and techniques of hackers. They master those tools and techniques, and then we certify them at the end by having them take the official Certified Ethical Hacker exam. Okay, and it's a 5-day course, and on the 5th day, it's mostly you testing. We do a half day of lecture and half day of getting you prepared again for the exam. And then the second half of the last day, you actually take the official exam and you're certified when you leave on Friday. Now, we've just introduced a more advanced version of it called the Certified Ethical Hacker Practical. Yeah, so not only do you have to do the written exam, but you have to do about a 10-hour practical where you are attacking targets that we've set up, and you have to break into those targets, get specific data off those targets, and write a report about what you did to get that certification. But that's more advanced. It's definitely not entry level, but people find it challenging because they actually have to not only prove that they have the knowledge from the written exam, but they have to actually demonstrate it hands-on. So those are kind of the two biggest, the most popular classes that we run right now. Obviously, incident response is really popular, and computer forensics is still really popular as well. But those are the main 3 core technical security classes that we run. And, what we found when you were talking about how do you know if this is happening to you, one of the things that we found, Joe, and we've got good data to reflect this, is the number one way that we've been able to improve the IQ of an organization when it comes to whether or not they're attacked is taking their technical people and putting them in these ethical hacking classes. Because what happens is suddenly when they go back and they're looking at their networks, they're able to see signs, they're able to see indicators that they just couldn't see before because they hadn't been exposed to what these attacks look like yet.
Are you putting a class on shortly? I mean, do you run these often? I mean, when's your next class?
The next one that I'm running there's one September 10th in Birmingham, Alabama. And it'll be a pretty good one. We have some good people signed up. And, I wanted to kind of point out one of the values that come out of these classes too is the networking, right? You have a security guy from this bank, and then you have an IT security guy from another bank, and they start talking to each other and, oh, well, this is happening. They share threats and they learn from each other just as much as they learn from me sometimes on certain topics. And I've even seen great connections, like people end up with jobs, right? Like there might be a person that's got maybe he's working as a Geek Squad technician at Best Buy or something like that, and he wants to get into cybersecurity, so he comes and takes a class. Well, also in the class is a chief information security officer for a Fortune 500 organization that's looking to hire people, right? And if this guy is really good in the class, that person ends up with a job offer all of a sudden. So the learning is a big part of it, but there are other peripheral things that people get out of these classes: the networking, getting jobs, and even getting employees. For me, myself, my practice, I've gotten some of my best employees from classes that I've taught, and been able to pull, people out of those classes that are unemployed. Obviously we can't hire people that already have jobs, because that would be a violation of integrity for your company to pay me to teach your employee, and then I steal them from you. So in our training, we have very strict contracts that say that we won't do that. And we'll also prevent, your employees from getting hired on with other people as they're in that job as well. But we do foster, if you need a job, this is one place to come. In these classes, you can probably get hooked up because there's a lot of people able to make hiring decisions in these classes.
Yeah. Well, it's a fascinating subject. I think a fascinating space to be in right now. Is there anything that you'd like to add to this conversation that maybe I didn't ask?
Yeah, sure. So we do quite a bit of public outreach and evangelism. So on our website, kmcybersecurity.com, I've got a very popular article that I wrote just a few months ago, and the article is titled, how to get into technical cybersecurity, like what your steps should be to get into it. And it's been a well-received article. It's been shared on LinkedIn and places like that thousands of times. So we're going to start now doing more of that, just kind of laying out a roadmap, doing outreach to show people. We want to kind of become the go-to bridge, right, for people to get into cybersecurity. Whether you have money or not, whether you're taking a class or not, even if you're taking a class from somewhere else or taking it from another provider, we kind of want to be a bridge to show you, look, go do these things first before you sign up for any class, so that, everybody ends up with a successful experience when they take the class, whether they do it with us or not.
Yeah. What's the level of IT knowledge that I need to take the class to get certified?
I think you have to have what we call power user level skills or better. For example, if you're listening, if I were to say, hey, tell me your Windows IP address, can you do that? If you can do that, then you're probably power user level. If I were to say, ping google.com and see if you're getting a response, if you know what that means and you can set down to your computer and execute that, then you probably are at that power user level. That's kind of a level check for us to see if the person has the right skills or not. If you've never seen the Windows command line before, then maybe you're not. Maybe there's some remediation or some things you need to kind of beef up on before you would sit a class like that. And again, that's part of what we're doing in outreach, is we're creating that kind of, hey, can you do these 10 things? If so, you're ready. If not, go look at these free videos and learn how to do this before you sign up for a class.
Okay. All right. Well, I would like to thank you very much. What's the best way for someone to contact you? Is it through your website?
They can reach me on the website, or they can also just reach me at kevans@kmcybersecurity.com.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank you very much, Keatron. I find it feel very fascinating. This podcast will be available on the Business 901 iTunes store and the Business 901 website. So I want to thank all the listeners for listening.
All right. Thank you, Joe.